If you ever find a hidden artifact sealed within your walls, pray it isn't this one. This forgotten grimoire carries a jagged legacy of disappearance and death that dates back centuries. Now that we've broken the seal, the ink is pulsing with a hunger we cannot satisfy, and time is running out. I remember the exact moment the wall opened because every person standing in that room went completely silent. Not the normal silence of people watching an old building being torn apart. It was something heavier, something that felt like the house itself had stopped breathing. The demolition crew had been hired to remove the damaged interior walls of the old Hawthorne property, a decaying farmhouse that had been abandoned for nearly 40 years. The place sat alone at the edge of a forest, surrounded by dead trees and fields that had turned gray under years of neglect. Nobody in the town wanted to talk much about the house. They only said it had a history. That was the kind of thing people said when they knew more than they wanted to admit. I was there documenting the renovation for a small historical preservation project. My job was simple: record the structure, photograph anything unusual, and preserve details before modern repairs erased the past. I had worked in dozens of old buildings before. I had found forgotten letters, old coins, hidden rooms, even photographs from another century. Nothing prepared me for what was behind that wall. The first sign was the sound. The demolition team had been cutting through the plaster when one of the workers stopped and tilted his head. "Did you hear that?" Everyone looked at him. "Hear what?" I asked. He stepped closer to the wall. A faint tapping came from inside. 3 slow knocks, then silence. The worker laughed nervously and said it was probably loose wood shifting behind the plaster. Old houses made strange noises. Everyone accepted that explanation because the alternative was impossible. The wall came down piece by piece. Dust filled the room. The smell of rotten wood and ancient dampness spread through the air. Beneath the plaster was a layer of old lath, and behind that, hidden between 2 support beams, was a small compartment. It had been carefully built into the wall, not accidentally. Someone had created it. The crew removed the remaining boards and revealed a narrow stone-lined cavity. Inside was nothing except a small object wrapped in dark, cracked cloth. Nobody touched it for several seconds. The strangest thing was the temperature. The room was freezing, but only around that opening. One worker reached inside and immediately pulled his hand back. "What?" another asked. He stared at his fingers. "It's cold," he whispered. "Cold like metal." He shook his head. "No, like something that was buried in snow." I stepped forward and looked inside. The object was a book, a very old book. Its cover was made from a strange uneven leather that looked almost black in the wax light. It had no title, no symbol, no markings. Only deep scratches across the surface, like someone had tried to destroy it and failed. I should have left it there. That thought still returns to me, because the moment my fingers touched the cover, I felt something. Not movement, not exactly. It was more like a pulse, a slow, faint vibration under my hand, like touching the skin of something sleeping. I immediately pulled away. Everyone saw my reaction. "What happened?" the foreman asked. I wanted to say nothing. I wanted to laugh and explain that old materials behaved strangely. Instead, I said it felt warm. The worker who had touched it first looked at me. "No," he said quietly. His face had gone pale. It was cold. That was the first thing that bothered me. The second was the writing. After carefully removing the book from the compartment, we placed it on a table and photographed it. The cover was dry and cracked, but when we opened it, the pages looked almost untouched. The first page contained faded handwriting, not printed text, handwriting. The ink was brown and thin, almost impossible to read. The language appeared to be some kind of old script mixed with symbols I had never seen before. I assumed it was a religious text or a personal journal. Then a drop of moisture fell onto the page. It came from my own hand, a tiny drop of sweat. The reaction was immediate. The ink changed. The faded letters darkened as if fresh ink was spreading through old veins. Lines that had been invisible appeared across the page. The symbols rearranged themselves. Everyone backed away. The words were no longer faded. They looked freshly written. The page now contained a sentence that none of us had seen before. The first depth has awakened. Nobody spoke. The room felt smaller. The foreman said it was some kind of chemical reaction. Old ink, moisture, something scientific. He repeated it several times, like he was trying to convince himself. But then the book made a sound, a quiet sound, like paper bending, except nobody was touching it. The pages turned by themselves, one after another, slowly, carefully, until the book opened to the middle. There was a name written there, a name from the house records, the original owner, Thomas Hawthorne. Under his name was a date, and below it, another sentence. He paid too late. We closed the book, we wrapped it, we locked it away, and we told ourselves that was the end. It wasn't. The next morning, the first worker who touched the book didn't come to work. His truck was still parked outside his house. His phone was still on his kitchen counter. His family said he had vanished during the night. At first, everyone assumed it was unrelated. People disappear, people leave. People have problems nobody knows about. But I couldn't stop thinking about the book, because the disappearance happened exactly 12 hours after the grimoire was removed from the wall. I began researching the history of the property. The deeper I went, the less normal it became. Old land records showed the house had been renovated many times over 300 years. The structure had changed, rooms were added, walls were removed, foundations were repaired, but every renovation had the same pattern. Someone disappeared, not immediately, always within 6 months. A carpenter in 1789, a builder in 1842, a family member in 1913, a contractor in 1978. Every disappearance was recorded as an accident, a runaway, or an unsolved case. But there was something else. Every renovation involved the same wall. The wall where we found the book. I spent nights going through digital archives and old newspaper reports. The details were disturbing. The missing people were always the ones who discovered something, a hidden space, a strange object, a strange mark. One newspaper article from 1913 described a man named Edward Hawthorne, the last owner of the property, before it was abandoned. The article mentioned that Edward became paranoid after finding an old family record hidden inside the east wall. He stopped sleeping. He refused to enter certain rooms, and according to his neighbors, he kept saying the same thing. The house is collecting. I found handwritten notes from Edward in a scanned archive. The handwriting was frantic. The first note said, "The book does not reveal secrets, it creates them." Another said, "I thought the pages showed the past. I was wrong. They show what it wants." Then the final note, the one that made my hands shake. "I buried it where my father buried it. I built over the wall. If anyone finds this, do not open the pages. It does not want blood. It wants agreement." I printed everything. I went back to the house. The grimoire was still there, locked inside a storage container. Nobody wanted to move it. Nobody wanted to destroy it, because we had already tried. The previous evening, the foreman had attempted to burn it. The fire went out, not slowly, instantly, like something had reached into the flames and removed them. That night, I stayed inside the property alone. I wanted answers. That was my mistake. Around midnight, I heard footsteps upstairs. The house had been empty. I checked every room. Nothing. Then I heard it again, a slow dragging sound, coming from behind the wall where the book had been found. I stood there holding my flashlight, staring at the old plaster. The sound stopped. Then something whispered my name, not loudly, not like a voice in the room, like a voice inside the wall. I stepped backward. The plaster cracked. A thin line appeared, then another. The wall began splitting open. Dust fell to the floor. Behind the plaster was darkness, a space that shouldn't have existed. I wanted to run. Instead, I looked inside. There was another compartment, much deeper than the first. Inside was a small collection of objects, a broken watch, an old photograph, a wedding ring, and a notebook. The notebook belonged to the missing worker, the one who disappeared. It was open. The last page contained only one sentence. I found the debt. The lights went out. Every sound in the house disappeared. Then the grimoire downstairs opened. I knew because I heard the pages turning. Fast, violently, I ran downstairs. The book was no longer wrapped. It was sitting open on the table. The pages were moving, and the ink was spreading. Not forming words, forming names, hundreds of them. Every person who had disappeared, every owner, every worker, every person connected to the house. Then a new name began appearing, mine. I felt sick. I slammed the book shut. The cover burned my hands. Not hot, cold, painfully cold. The pages opened again. A new sentence appeared. The depth must be even. The room darkened. The shadows changed. There were shapes in the corners. Human shapes, standing silently, watching. I couldn't move, because among those shadows I recognized faces. The missing worker, the old owners, people from photographs, people who had vanished decades ago. They weren't ghosts. That would have been easier. They looked trapped, like they were waiting, like they wanted me to understand something. One of them stepped forward. It was Edward Hawthorne. His face looked exhausted, terrified. He whispered, "Don't pay it." The shadows behind him moved. Something taller stood among them. Something that did not have a face. The room became freezing. Edward looked behind me. His expression changed. Not fear, regret. "You already touched it," he whispered. Then the grimoire opened, a page turned, and the sentence appeared. The agreement was made. I realized what Edward meant. The book never needed blood. It needed a choice. Every person who touched it became part of the chain. The previous owners weren't victims of the book. They were the ones who kept passing it on. The wall wasn't hiding the book. It was containing it, and we had broken the seal. The shadows began moving closer. The faceless figure reached toward the book. The pages started tearing themselves. Ink poured from the paper like black liquid. It crawled across the table, across the floor, toward me. I grabbed the grimoire and threw it back into the hidden compartment. The moment it touched the stone, everything stopped. The shadows vanished. The cold disappeared. The house became silent. For a few seconds I believed it was over. Then I saw the wall. The opening was closing. The plaster was repairing itself, not falling, rebuilding. Like the house was healing. I ran outside. I never returned. The property was demolished months later. At least, that is what the records say. But there is one detail that still bothers me. Before the demolition, the workers found something inside the new wall. Another compartment, another book, the same black cover. Only this time it had a title, my name, and beneath it was a date that hadn't happened yet. I don't know what the grimoire truly is. I don't know who created it. I don't know if the people trapped inside were being punished, or if they were protecting something worse. But I know one thing. Old houses keep secrets. Sometimes they hide memories. Sometimes they hide crimes. And sometimes they hide things that were never meant to be found. So if you ever discover a sealed space inside your walls, remember my story. Don't open it. Don't touch what is inside. And whatever you do, never let the ink learn your name.